Alright, so first step, whether you're forging or doing stock removal, you gotta get some metal, obviously. And I like to do a combination of forging and stock removal. Whereas, you could see I've profiled the knife. This was outside for a while, but you can see I've still got a pretty straight edge on here, and I'd like to curve it out. I could do that by forging, which with this there's not a lot to move, which wouldn't be so bad, but nor would grinding it off. So I'd probably would do it like that, just grind it off. You know, if I was doing stock removal, I could cut these parts here, or I could just forge it into shape, right? So there's step one. You got a knife. I guess step one is really get the tools, but assuming you have tools at your disposal. So then you would move to, you can see this is one where I started to forge the tip to a point. I decided not to just cut it off. So, and it was an angle bracket of some sort, shelf bracket. And it had holes in it already, but I can incorporate those into the handle. Give space for the epoxy to bond. So that's a good piece. That'll make a large knife. This one is giving me nothing but trouble. That's why it's still. I left it in the. I was using a charcoal forge and I left it in the forge too long, and you can see right here. Hopefully you can see that the profile is thinner right here, and on the back too. Yeah, that's a good shot. In fact, there's even little hairline cracks forming, like right there. So I really can't. I mean, I could cut it off right there and forge this out. You can always draw metal out and make use of it, but that's just been uncooperative. There's another just piece of stock steel, which here's a knife that I forged out of the same, still in progress, and here's another one in progress. So you gotta, through whatever method, decide what kind of knife you're gonna make, what kind of handles you're gonna use, and I like to kind of figure that out in the beginning. Sometimes I have no idea and I just have to start shaping it, and sometimes you kind of have to work with the metal because sometimes it doesn't want to work with you. And there's full tang knives, which I like. Here's one I'm still working on, a Bowie knife, and I've pinned the handles with brass pins and epoxied them on. I've got a guard, and I did stock removal with this one, as you can tell, but there's still a lot of polishing to do because I decided I want to go with high polish on this one. And at the very least, even if I wasn't going up to 500, 1200 grit, I definitely want to get, here's a deep scratch that I want to get out, which one of my big mistakes is getting impatient and going up to the next grit. You definitely want, you know, it's hard for me to practice what I preach, but you definitely want to sand out every scratch before you go up to the next grit. It's just, you're not going to save any time. So I got a little distracted by handles. Because in general, I mean, there's several different kind of handles you can make always, but in general there's two kinds. You got the kind that you fix with pins, full tang, and then you got the kind that you either burn in or epoxy in, drill in 2 holes, or like into antler. So this would be an example of this. You know, I have my tang that I'm gonna affix into this handle when the time comes, and I'm gonna put a cross guard on this. But so once you get your basic designer knife and you start making it, and you forge it, or stock removal. Stock removal is definitely easier, but in a lot of ways, I believe that forging is more effective, has more character to it, and well, by effective I mean you get a better quality knife. The logic behind that would be, here's a kitchen knife I've been working on, and it was stock removal. And when I do stock removal, I have to grind that bevel, which I have to grind a bevel with forging too, but I'm basically taking the steel and just shaping it. With forging, you can see this one doesn't have a bevel at all. It's not going down to an edge yet. But I've started working on it as I forge it. So I guess not at all, but I've forged down the edge and I'm getting it there, and that's less metal in the end that I have to remove. And it also compacts the molecules a bit and makes it stronger steel. So I believe. So that would be, I'm bouncing all around, but it'll be your first step. You profile, and then you design your knife in your head or on paper. It's really best to draw it out, but then once you got your knife into shape and you're satisfied with it, the next step would be to grind it flat, as in get all the pits out. And here's several examples of knives. This one I ball peened, and I'm just going to wire brush. It's a lot easier to make. But these, you can see I've ground to 120 on the belt grinder, and they have the grind lines on them. There's a large blade, whatever you'd want to call it, sword, saber, katana. So these have been ground down, and I'm fairly happy with the condition they're in. There's no major pits or scratches. They're essentially flat, and they're clean, and they're ready for heat treatment. Also, at this point, I would drill the holes for the pins on the handles, and also the holes for the epoxy to bond, and dry fit my handles and make sure everything's fitting right and I have it all set up the way I want it. And then heat treat, where you heat it up. You heat the metal up till a magnet doesn't stick to it anymore, and quench it, whether you're water quenching or oil quenching. Once you quench it, you've got brittle steel, and you have to temper it by heating it up just a bit, and you have a color scale from purple to brass or wheat or gold, whatever you'd like to refer to it as. There's some more knives then. Here's one that I'm not ready for heat treat with. You can see it's still got pits in it, and it's not been fully beveled, but you can see I've been working on it. Now once you heat treat it, you've got hardened steel that's tempered. It's no longer brittle. It has some flex to it, but it's hard enough to keep an edge. Because if it's too hard, the edge will just chip off in flakes, and if it's too soft, the edge will just roll over, curl over on the end. So at that point, you could attach your handles, whatever else. And then your next step, at that point, you pretty much have something that resembles quite fairly a knife. Anyone would assume it's a knife, but it's not finished. Because after you heat treat it, you're going to have to polish it all over again because you're going to have carburization on the blade, which is not nearly as bad as the first phase, but it's still a job. And then after you've heat treated, so we'll start from the beginning because we kind of hopped around, but profile your knife, forge your knife, sand and bevel your knife, dry fit your handles, heat treat your knife, temper your knife, affix your handles. I'm sorry, before you fix the handles, you want to polish it up after you heat treat it, clean it up anyway. Affix your handles, and at that point you have something that resembles a knife, and essentially is, but it doesn't have an edge on it yet, because if you put an edge on it before you heat treat it, you're going to warp your blade. So you only want to bring it down to almost an edge where it's thin but still has visible edge, flat spot on the where the edge will be. So then after you're heat treated and you got it cleaned up and you put your handles on, then you can sharpen it. Actually, I use sharpen it very last, so I'll polish it and then sharpen it, which, I'll get this to focus. That is a sharp knife. It has a full edge, it's polished, it has a handle fixed. And then you can make a sheath for it, which obviously each of these steps can be studied into for hours, but that would be the overall. And then I guess I'll touch on materials a little bit. I like using brass. I've got different sized brass rod here. There's 1/4 inch and what is that, 3/16, and a lot of options there. These are 3-foot sections. You can get them at the hardware store. And here's another example of a finished knife, even though I'm going to have to go back and clean up the blade because it's been neglected and was touched. Whenever I show my knives to people, they have a tendency to touch the blade. Ooh, smooth, yeah. When they get their the oils from their hand on there or whatever, grease, I don't know, moisture, sweat from their hands, and steel will rust overnight. But here's a good example of saddle stitching, nice tight saddle stitching. Leather, I got my stock woods. I like cutting up logs and getting, sections out of it that I can turn into handles. But in the beginning, I got tired of using scrap stuff all the time, and I was out of the hardwoods, and I went to the hardware store, and I was actually surprised to find that this is some red oak 2x1, and this was maybe 2-3 feet, and it was like $1 a foot. Not bad at all. Plus, you've already got your basic shape. All you have to do is cut it in half, cut it to length, and drill your holes, and then shape it, whatever. So you got your steel, your handle material, your pin material, and your leather. And then I'll go on a quick tour of tools, because I have amassed quite a collection of them. Here's my scrolling saw, which I haven't been using much lately because I've had access to a bandsaw I borrowed from my buddy, but I usually use that for cutting the handles in half and to shape. Got a bench grinder with a wire wheel and a high grit grinding wheel. I've got another bench grinder with a low grit grinding wheel and a buffing pad for polishing the knives. I've got a 4x36 inch belt sander with a 6-inch disc sander. I've got the bandsaw that I'm borrowing. I've got Kitty. Kitty always helps. Here's where I do my polishing. I bought a little polishing jig, and the stones are wearing out on it quick, but I was pleased to find out that these things, which I thought were cheapo, actually fit into my sharpening jig and work very well. So here's the suction cup, works alright. Once you get water on it, it actually sticks really well. This little puppy slides in there. Knife, the stone clamps on it, and the knife sits on the edge here, and you can slide it back and forth so you can get your angle. Here's where I bevel. I've got this little table set up. Where, and this 1-inch belt sander where I can put the knife on a block. I've got this bolt on the back of the block. I can back the bolt up, and what that'll do is raise up this end, which in turn will angle the front and clamp the blade edge up and slide it back and forth until I get my bevel. That works pretty well. There's a soft jaw bench vise. I put some maple. My drill press, just a little $60 Harbor Freight drill press, works great. And it's not high quality machine, but for what I'm doing, works great. I got a fan here. I got a little bathroom vent fan up in the corner. I got another bench vise, heavy duty bench vise. In this bench vise, I have leather jaws, leather glued onto the jaws, which comes really in handy when I'm clamping knives. Got my high-speed cutoff wheel and angle grinder with a cutoff wheel, which actually I prefer this one. It works faster. It's got a bigger wheel on it. Even though this one has more RPM, higher RPM, it really doesn't cut faster with a smaller wheel. Plus, there's certain angles that are hard to get, especially once the wheel wears down. Steel table is really handy when you're working with hot metal. I started with a wood bench and definitely had issues. A welder comes in handy, but I don't actually use it too often for knife making. Though what I do tend to use it for, if I have to, is when these guards don't fit perfectly, because you have to file a little notch on either side of the blade for it to fit in. And sometimes you get some play between the handles, and it's really hard, but you can tack a little spot weld and sand it down and get a tighter fit. My forge, this is just ceramic insulation. It goes up to like 2,000 degrees. It doesn't burn. And I got Bernzomatic TS8000 propane torch. As far as I know, it's the most intense model they make, or highest output. With a hose to a nice large propane tank. I highly suggest getting one of those if you're going to do this, because these, or the short fat ones, are too expensive and hard to manage with compared to this hose. Table saw, which I recently acquired. So I've yet to actually incorporate it majorly into my work, though obviously I can cut my knife scales in half. An anvil, I'm pretty happy with this anvil actually, for a little Harbor Freight, what a 50-pounder. And I built a stand for it. I wrapped a chain around it to keep it from ringing, and it's actually got a nice, fairly dull thud to it. And that is the gist of it. I've pretty much covered all the basics. Yeah, I got a shop vac, dust collection, You really can't have too much of that. And of course, lots and lots of sandpaper. So there's a tour of my knife making world. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy.